First, let me start off by saying welcome. So thank you so much for your interest. Thank you all for being here. My name is Maren Brennan, and I work in admissions. I'm excited to be here today to be helping you all learn about our MLA, LA1 and 2 landscape architecture program. And I'm going to be just in the background, addressing some questions. Emily, who is our graduate program director, is going to be giving a wonderful presentation. I'm going to hand it over so that everyone can introduce themselves, but basically there's going to be a presentation, and then I'll return to address some questions. Oh, before I hand it over, I do want to say, if you could enter any questions that you have in the Q&A chat box, which is a few icons to the right of the chat box where you've been telling us where you're tuning in from. That would be great. That way I can keep track of questions. We're going to get to as many as we can. And great, I'll hand it over to Emily to introduce.
Great. Thanks, Marin. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the open house today. As Marin said, my name is Emily Vogler, and I'm the graduate program director. And my goal for this morning is just to be able to share a bit about our program here at RISD. And then, like Marin mentioned, we're going to be opening it up for question and answers. We'll have a couple other students joining us when they get out of class at around 10:30. And then also just making a note that I see some familiar names in the chat, but if you haven't reached out to me directly, feel free to do so at any time as you're working on your application or thinking about applying. So I'll drop my email in the chat. And so feel free to just reach out with any questions you have following this or just while you're putting together your materials. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. Excellent. Can everybody see my screen? Yeah?
Looks
Okay,
great.
fantastic. Excellent. So like I said, my goal today is just to provide a bit of an overview about our program, the landscape architecture program here at RISD. And I'm gonna, go through a bit of some of the kind of values and ethics that underlie our program. And then I'll talk a bit about our curriculum, but I'll also just include a lot of great images of student work and field work that we do here in the program, just to give you a sense of what it's like to study here at RISD. So I'm here presenting today, but I am only one of an amazing group of faculty that we have here at RISD. We have, a range of both full-time and part-time faculty, making up around 20 faculty members altogether. We have around 50 students in our department across both the MLA1, which is the 3-year program, and also the MLA2 program. So we're a pretty tight community. One thing I realized is I don't have a lot of photos of our studio space, but we have a really wonderful studio that we call home to our program that creates a really nice environment in terms of just the way that we work together as a group and as a community here at RISD, which is really an important part of how we structure our program. And so what's nice about the different faculty is that we're all coming from different backgrounds. We all have come from different kind of educational backgrounds, different practices. Then we bring that to the way that we teach and also to the work that we do in our own research and our own design practices. And so, like I said, I want to start off by talking a bit about the kind of mission and the values that underlie our program. We kind of have this designing the unimagined. And I think so much for me about landscape architecture is that we don't just study sites, we don't just study landscapes, but we also are a projective practice, right? We're thinking about what is yet to be, right? The unimagined. And we're asking students to engage in this process, right? Of being able to imagine and work with communities in order to envision futures that don't yet exist. And that's a big part of the way that we operate and the way that we think about landscape architecture. Really is this as a discipline, right, that operates between the cultural and the natural world, addressing these design issues that are inherent in a range of scales. And so to me, this is a really important role that we can play in terms of this understanding of both the kind of natural systems, the ecological systems, at a range of sites we might be working on, but also the human aspects as well, right? And so this understanding of where and how do we think about, for example, the restoration of sites, but where and how do we also think about public access, and bringing those conversations together is really important. Like I said, I'll be showing some studio work throughout the presentation here. This is a studio that I ran a couple of years ago in the city of Fall River, where students were thinking about what are some kind of short-term strategies, economic strategies for thinking about how the city can imagine itself as it kind of moves forward. So this idea of kind of tying into that historic industries of the city, the historic textile mills, and thinking about where and how to use that to reactivate the city, and then also where and how the public realm of kind of existing public spaces and potential new open spaces can begin to help to create that sense of place within the city. And so often, like I said, kind of thinking across both these kind of cultural systems of the kind of economics and culture of place, but also about these kind of natural systems and where and how those get intertwined in the work that we do. We are a landscape architecture program here within our art and design school, which means that we aim to foster this creative energy that comes from being surrounded by other disciplines like ceramics and textiles and graphic design and industrial design. And we try to kind of foster that creative energy in order to take on these really kind of important social, political, and ecological challenges that we're dealing with right now in the 21st century, and to think about that and how we approach that through experimentation and through collaboration. And so we really, kind of since I started teaching at RISD, which is now, over 12 years ago, really asking this question of what does it mean to study landscape architecture at an art and design school, and where and how do we bring that into our practice and understand how we as landscape architects contribute to this constellation of other disciplines, and where and how do we kind of collaborate, where and how do we understand each other's methods, and where and how does that inform our practices moving forward. These are some images from a studio that we ran last year where we went down to visit Puerto Rico in order to understand flooding within the city. You'll see this through a lot of the photos. We do a lot of field work. We do a lot of site visits as part of our work, but really trying to understand some of these complex social, political, and ecological issues and the way that they're all intertwined, right? So we're looking at in Puerto Rico, we were looking at issues of flooding along the Rio Piedras, but understanding that through meeting with local community groups, community land trusts, and organizations that are working on the ground, right? So this understanding that we always have to be weaving together all of these different systems when we're looking at sites. We believe that design is a political act and that we could either reinforce or challenge existing social, institutional, economic, and ideological power structures, or that we can challenge them, right? So this understanding of where and how we encourage our students to take a stance in the work that they're doing, whatever that might mean for them. To us, it's important that we're just asking those questions of like, for whom do we practice? Who are our clients? And how do we begin to shape a practice that might be aligned with each kind of our own individual values and the way that we want to contribute in the work that we do to find meaning in that work. And so we always are asking our students, especially as they progress through the program into their final year, to begin to take a stance, to not just to think of the study of landscape as an objective practice, but also one that is informed by your own beliefs. And so we are constantly asking students to do that through their work here at RISD. A big part of our program is kind of about this material and field-based practice. We believe in cultivating curiosity, keen observation, and thoughtful questioning through being in the field, getting familiar with the materials that we work with as landscape architects. This image here on the left is one that I'll be talking about in a bit, but it's from the Sustainability Lab, which is an endowed studio that runs for a whole year, where students investigate a specific material in depth, right, in order to understand how they can work with that material, where the material comes from, and where and how they might have opportunities to reimagine the use of those materials in our practices. And so this was students doing a kind of a moisture and compression testing with clay. Clay was the first year material that we looked at. Wood was the second year. And this year we're looking at waste fibers, including paper, wool, and whatnot. And so every year we take on a material through kind of an in-depth investigation that gets this kind of material and field-based practice kind of as part of that. Since we are kind of within this art institution, right, we take this R-space approach to research, exploration, experimentation, emphasizing field work and place-based embodied methods of acquiring knowledge. So this is a great image in our first, in the first studio that students take at RISD. It's called Design Principles. We often work at a site that's called Tillinghast Place, which is a large coastal site that RISD owns and that faculty and students have access to. And many people spend a lot of time there because it's a beautiful beautiful place to escape. But we also run our first year studios there, our first year fall studio there. And what's great about it is that we're able, because we own the property, we're able to do design build experiments on the site. We also always do these soil test pits where we dig a kind of soil pit that's, often around, 4 to 5 feet down, in order to really help students to gain that embodied understanding of the soil profile, right? So it's an important part of understanding a site and understanding how we even begin to understand the range of conditions across the site. So we dig these test pits from the top of the hill down into the forest, at the marsh edge, and on the beach, right? And by doing that transect and digging those holes, we begin to get an actual kind of embodied and material understanding of soil, right? And how it changes across that transect. And so wherever possible, we're trying to find these ways that we can move past just an abstraction or generalization into the specifics of understanding a site. And so this kind of visceral, the sensorial and physical aspects of the site are best understood through this direct exploration and observation, right? So by being on our sites, by doing kind of extensive site visits, we learn field methods that help us to understand where and how we also that can inform our practice, right? So doing soil cores or just being in the field and actually doing work to understand what it takes to actually construct the landscapes that we're designing. This is an image from the Sustainability Lab. Like I mentioned last year, their focus was on woods, wood and woods. And so they were both looking at the ecology of forests across New England, but also then understanding how do you work with wood as a material and what does it mean to really understand what it means to shape and to sculpt wood, where there might be opportunities by getting a really kind of embodied understanding of that material. And so the nature of the Sustainability Lab is that students start off in the fall with kind of just a deep dive and investigation of that material, finding different ways of working with it, whether that's milling or sawing or, every semester or every year it's different depending on the material, but really gaining that material understanding that then can inform the spring semester where students are able to then kind of figure out where and how they individually might want to work with that material. And so this was a shot from that first day of the Sustainability Lab when students were on the site working together in order to really start to understand wood this way. And so this gets to something I'll be talking about a bit later, which is also just like the way we understand landscapes at these multiple scales, right? So we could understand the forest, we could understand the woods, that might exist across New England. And then we could also understand wood from the scale of the molecules, right? The scale of the cells that come together to make wood, right? And all of those, that ability to shift scales and work across these different scales and to understand those implications is a key part of what I think that we as landscape architects bring in our practice. We also kind of in terms of the field work that we do, this is a seminar that we've run for the past 2 or 3 years now, which is called SiteWorks, where on that same site, Tillinghast Place, students have worked to convert what was a kind of 1/4 acre of lawn into a meadow, right? And so what's been great about that is it gives, oftentimes when you're working on a project, you'll be like, make this into a meadow, but what does it actually take, right? What does it actually mean to transform a site over time? And so by giving students the opportunity to work on this site over a couple of years and to document it and to think about where and how they could also teach others, about the site and about the transformation that's taking place has been an integral part and gives students the opportunity to look at, to learn about soil and learn about moisture, learn about different species of plants, learn about what it takes, to kind of manage these sites over time. And so once again, like where and how do we get that embodied understanding to move past just the abstraction of representation or drawings into the real world materials also that we're working with as landscape architects. And also these are images from our first, our summer program, which is the 1-month intensive that we do for all incoming students. It's called Design Foundations. And it's also, we spend 2 weeks of it kind of it's called Summer Ecology, kind of Field Ecology and Design Foundations. And we spend the first 2 weeks in the field entirely, but getting an understanding of kind of the regional landscapes of New England, whether that's kind of understanding salt marshes with kind of field ecologists. So like going out in the field with Tom Kuchar and being like, let's study the salt marsh, let's study the mummy chog that exists in the salt marsh, right, to really understand it. Or whether it's a matter of getting an understanding of how to work with a level and being able to, in this exercise, we were working with a level in order to reproject contours back onto the landscape and then draw them in the landscape in order to be able to visualize how contours describe slope, right? And so these ways that we could begin to understand the practices that we have and the ecologies that we work with, the skills that we develop through this kind of embodied way of being in the landscape. Another big part of the way that our program operates is through experimentation and critical making. This kind of creative exchange between hands-on and shared knowledge building is an important part of what we do. The image to the right is design critique, a review of student work in the first year in that first semester studio that I mentioned. And this is often how we operated as a studio, as part of our studio culture. You know, students will work on a project and then they will get to practice presenting that work to others, right? And then have a conversation about the work. And one of the things that I appreciate about our program is that we're a supportive program, right? We believe in the kind of role of critique, the role of having conversations about work, but always thinking about where and how that helps the individual student advance from wherever it is that they come into the program, right? Because one of the things that makes our program so interesting is that we have students coming from such a wide range of backgrounds, right? Some come from design backgrounds, some from other disciplines, but to me, that's really what makes our program so rich, is that range of experience. And so the critique provides a one-on-one way that we could help individual students think about where and how they could advance their own practice, their own skill building as they move through our program. And so this kind of through this iterative process, right? This by iteration, I mean, you know, you work on something, you get feedback, or you will provide your own feedback on your own work, and then you kind of go back in and you take another pass at it, right? So this understanding that it's not just about kind of a final outcome, but it's also about just that process. And we're a very process-oriented department. While we will work on beautiful final drawings like the ones that you see here on the right, we're also interested in the kind of messy process that gets you to the point, right, of being able to do that. And so that's really important part of the way that we work in our department. And so through this iterative exploration of the practical and material theoretical ideas, alongside also the study of precedents, right, meaning like where and how do we learn from what other people have done, we encourage students to push the limits of their own imagination, right? So how do we learn from others? How do we then bring our own experiences, our own perspectives into that in order to then be able to push our discipline forward, or for each of you, be able to push your work forward as in your kind of own creative practice. And so, like I said before, you know, it is about these kind of finished, beautiful drawings, but it's also about just this kind of messy process where we get to know things, right? And kind of making these relationships between ideas and mediums and methods that we use to create, right? So this was a thesis student work where they were kind of looking at a material process of this kind of seaweed and understanding where and how it can be rematerialized, recontextualized, reused in coastal restoration projects, right? So this understanding of where do things come from, and then where and how can we reimagine them in the building of landscapes. And so it's as much about the kind of messy process and the failures, but the questions that we're asking that are driving the work that we're doing. And so, and like I said, in thinking about process, we believe in these practices of making that are deeply rooted in this material understanding and the mechanics that govern landscape ecology, tectonics, and social infrastructure. And so understanding that landscapes are made up of places and people and practices, right? And the stewardship practices are extremely important, right? Thinking about where and how communities currently interact with sites and where and how they might interact with sites in the future is an important part of what we do in order to build that community ownership, in order to be able to build this understanding of place and kind of help people to reconnect communities and place through the sites that we're designing, right? And that's really an important part of that. These are a couple of images of I've ran a couple of studios and seminars where we're working with willow as a material and thinking about where and how this type of willow spiling, which is this method of erosion control along rivers, where and how that could actually be done by community members as a way of helping people to re-engage in the places where they live, right? And so to me, these questions of stewardship, I think are really important for us to consider as landscape architects. So it's not just about designing the sites and being done, but it's about where and how the way we design sites and the way that people can engage with these sites can actually help to foster stewardship and build that connection to community and place, right? Often when I run these types of workshops, there's a large meal that's part of it. And so this idea of like, where and how do we engage communities in our work and in that practice as well. And so that's kind of, like I said, we kind of are very field-based. We work very much with these kind of like materials and this iterative process. And we also really believe in this importance of design research by kind of investigating and reimagining the built environment. This image on the left here is a photo from a studio that ran, I think, 2 years ago with Tiago Torres Campos, a faculty member in our department who's from Portugal. And he brought a group of students. They were able to go to Lisbon for about a week in order to better understand the kind of hydrological systems of the city, right? The rivers that have been buried underground and the issues around flooding and drought within the city, and where and how they could think about different ways of reimagining those systems in order to better support, both the kind of city in terms of addressing those kind of issues around flooding and drought, but also think about where and how that could shape public space and improve people's kind of experiences in the city, but also their kind of sense of place around around the urban environment. And so it was a wonderful studio. Students had an amazing time on the field visits that they went on, and really allowed for them to think about what they learned in our program and where and how they could apply that to other sites, right? Other geographies, other contexts. And that's a really important part of what we're trying to help our students to gain an understanding of is, we work a lot within Rhode Island and New England in our early studios, but what we're wanting to also do is make sure that students understand that we're learning the principles, right, of how we learn about sites, how we learn about places, how we design, and then to help them to develop the skills to then understand the types of questions they would ask when they're working in other sites, in other contexts, and other geographies. And so, especially in our final year, we tend to run studios that are kind of broader in terms of the kind of geographical areas that they're looking at, and kind of going back to those kind of principles of like, how do we learn about this place? What are the questions we need to ask? What are the methods that we can use for investigating and researching in order to now be able to make informed design decisions, right? So we're always trying to draw this connection between the kind of work that we're doing within our studios, but also then the work that our students are going to go on to do, which most likely will be around the world. And so through this process of design research, students gain an understanding of the diverse social, geographical, economic, infrastructural, and ecological systems that form the foundation of designing the future landscapes that we're working with. And so research and design research can take a wide range of kind of meanings, within landscape architecture. On the image on the left is a community engagement event that we ran as part of one of the studios. We had a whole range of different types of community engagement events where students were asked to think of how they could use their design skills, not only to design landscapes, but also design the process through which communities are brought into a conversation about the places where they live, right? And so really trying to prioritize and think about where and how do we engage communities in meaningful ways, because that's an important part of our practice in landscape architecture, and how do we begin to bring that into the studio? And so that is a form of research, right? It's about asking people on the ground, what are the issues that you're interested in? What are your concerns? What are your hopes for the future of your community? And then understanding where and how that could actually inform the work that we then do as in our design work. Research can also be, image on the right is an image from a studio that was looking at the kind of urban tree plan for Providence. And so trying to build this understanding of the kind of urban tree canopy, what species exist, and developing a crowdsourced way of documenting and understanding the role of trees within the urban environment, right? So there was a whole kind of fold out map component of it. There was an online app component of it as well. And so these are all different ways that we can learn about places and learn how we can engage people in the conversations around the future of the landscapes that we're working on. And so we draw on the kind of 4 core learning sequences that are within our program. I'll touch a little bit on our curriculum at the very end, but essentially we have seminars and studios that look at materials, history and theory, communication and visualization, and ecology and hydrology. And through this, the students get to explore a wide range of design methods to conceptualize and shape physical spaces that thoughtfully integrate aesthetic values with sustainable ethics as well, right? So this question of like, we are a profession that works with the kind of understanding of aesthetics of landscapes. And so where and how do we bring that in and bring that understanding of the kind of embodied experience of being in a place? And the power of place, and where and how do we then kind of bring that into alignment with the kind of sustainable ethics that underlie a lot of the work that we do in general as landscape architects. So whether that's reimagining infrastructural systems, this was an amazing model from a student that was looking at the kind of layered infrastructure of a city, and the understanding of where and how kind of landscape and structure can be merged in order to improve, right, the kind of larger kind of systems of these kind of infrastructural systems that we work with. We also encourage students to blend a variety of methods spanning artistic and design practices, integrating both hand drawing and digital approaches for design iteration and communication. This is a really important part of our program. The first semester of our program is entirely done by hand. We believe it's an important way for students to develop skills of understanding how to represent and how to ideate, how to think about sites. And so, what are the different ways that we can represent landscapes so we could sketch them in order to research them, to understand them, but then also be able to communicate that to others, right? And so these are just a couple of sketches from the first year where students were trying to research and understand kind of marsh and riparian ecosystems, understanding it from the point of view of the specific species, but also understanding it from the point of view of how do landscapes change over time, because it's one of the most important things that we do within landscape architecture. That's very different from architecture, right? Within architecture, you design a building, and usually the kind of day it opens is it's kind of like peak, right? It's like it's the new finishes, it's so nice and shiny, right? And then after that, it just starts to like deteriorate over time depending on maintenance. Whereas within landscape architecture, when we design a site and we first install it, it's often not for 20 years, right, that we actually get to see the glory and the full vision of the design come into fruition. And so we really have to be thinking about these different timeframes when we're designing, when we're working, and to think about where and how we can incorporate time and this kind of time-based practice that we're engaged in, because we work with living materials, and where and how do we represent that? How do we communicate about that, in order to think about both how a site can perform the day it's constructed, the moment that people are first able to visit it, but also then where and how it can evolve, right, as it changes over time. And so it's a really amazing thing that I think we're one of the few disciplines that really gets to work with time in that way. And it's a really rich medium. So obviously through our representations, we want students to be exploring that as well. The last big kind of idea is multi-scalar thinking, from region to city to site to material. Like I said previously, I think that's one of the most important skills that we bring from kind of the as landscape architects to projects. This ability to really be thinking across all of these different scales, right, is key to our practice. And my students in our studio, our Puerto Rico studio last year, were at some point we're describing it a bit as like scale whiplash, because you're like going from a regional scale understanding of the river and the kind of watershed down to a site scale understanding of an intervention, and then back out to the regional scale to understand how the implications of that work. And so it's one of these things, though, that we really believe is an important skill that needs to be developed through practice. So we kind of emphasize the importance of developing the skill, landscape architecture, to tackle these large-scale regional environmental and social challenges and addressing these issues through actionable, site-specific, and material-based solutions. And to me, that's one of the greatest things that we get to contribute as landscape architects, right? We're like I said earlier at the beginning of this, we're a projective practice, right? We're not just scientists who are studying existing conditions, right? We are thinking about actionable, right, and applied applied practices of change, right? And so to me, that is a really important thing that we can do, is to say, yes, we are kind of thinking about these large scale ecological issues, whether it's about biodiversity or climate change, but then this question of like, what do we do? How is this actionable? How does this concern manifest itself at a site scale, right? In order to be able to make change in the world, right? And so to me, this is an extremely important part of what we do. And it's like, where and how do we ask the big questions about the kind of bigger issues that we're dealing with, whether those are kind of larger societal issues, larger cultural issues, but then where and how do we come down to a point, being able to operate from a point of action, right? From a point of change and making change. And so this is just an example of some of the multi-scalar way we work in the department. This is on the image on the right is Narragansett Bay, which is, we're up at the very tip here in Providence. That is our home. And we very much think of Narragansett Bay as a kind of living laboratory for the work that we do. And then the image on the left is a student who is exploring different ways of thinking about erosion control and how we deal with that kind of land-water edge, right? And where and how kind of maybe some of these kind of historic methods of just building a wall, where and how we could kind of build on that and enhance that through thinking more creatively about that materials, about the design of those different kind of modules. And so, you know, students are both thinking at this kind of larger watershed scale, larger kind of bay scale to say, okay, where are we having issues of erosion? What are the different ways that those kind of issues of erosion are kind of playing out across the bay? And then where and how do we think about how we could address that through our design work? And so this ability to work across scales is really some of the key parts of what we do as a discipline, but really something that we prioritize in our program, right? We don't want to entirely just stay at that regional scale. We want to come down to sites. We want to come down to materials to be able to talk about action. There's also a kind of a way that we work as we're thinking across these different scales and thinking about the different ways that our modeling practices and our drawing practices can help us to explore these different issues. And so this is a model that a student built where they were both kind of building a model out of cardboard, but then also then doing kind of a Photoshop in order to test placing it on a site, right? And so this ability to work across these different mediums in order to understand how we can design at these different scales and what exactly that means. I would actually meets a site, right? So how do we think big, then where and how does it actually land on a specific site? And then moving beyond just the site is like, where and how does it also land when it comes down to the actual construction of these sites, right? A big part of what we do in landscape architecture is doing construction documents, right? And while we don't necessarily emphasize that in our program, we do think that it's important that students gain a bit of an understanding of how to observe, how to notice these different things that make up the physical realities of the landscapes that we inhabit and that we design, and different ways that we can work with that and think more creatively about the specifics, right, of the design work that we do. And lastly, just a big part of our program, right, is about individual expression, finding unique expressions through cross-disciplinary and creative processes. And so because we're here at an art and design school, we do love that our students are able to take electives across other disciplines as well. And we especially love it when those electives come back and infuse and change the way that students actually practice within our department, right? And so we've seen that in different ways with different students over the years. You know, one year we had a student who was really into glass blowing and going into the glass studio. And at some point I was like, how is he going to bring this back into his work in landscape architecture? And he developed an amazing thesis that was all about kind of nighttime landscapes, luminosity, and where and how to think about light within the nighttime landscapes. And it was beautiful, right? And so I love it when our students are able to take advantage of all the other resources that exist at RISD, other disciplines, and figure out their own individual kind of expression in their own practice. And so really kind of graduate program at RISD, right, it's structured to facilitate your growth as a designer, as an artist, and as a scholar by providing both these foundational skills and opportunities for pushing the boundaries of what's possible in your chosen practice during and after RISD, right? So with this understanding that you all come to RISD as, you know, from all of your different backgrounds, but where and how do you think of yourself and position yourself as a designer, as an artist, and as a scholar? And what does that mean for you in your practice moving forward? And at some points that might be a bit more experimental like this, where students are kind of modeling how to sense landscapes, or it might be a bit more practical in terms of like, how do we reimagine highway infrastructure, right? It's caused so many issues over time. How can we re-envision this? And also just this ways of working, right? And the ways of thinking about our own artistic expression and our own ways of making, as we shift materials, as we shift scales, and as we think about what it means to translate from a drawing to a model to a different material in your model. And all those begin to inform the way that we work as landscape architects. So those are kind of the big underlining, I'd say, values of our program, some of our big kind of the work that we do. I'm not going to get into details about our curriculum, but we've really thought carefully about our curriculum and where and how each semester builds on one another, but also where and how a studio could be supported by different seminars within the program and outside of it. And so, both the MLA program, which is a 3-year program, and also an MLA 2 program, which is the 2-year program. The 2-year program tends to be a lot more flexible in terms of the amount of electives. But with that, I think, there's so much more we could talk about in terms of the curriculum and getting into some of the nitty-gritty of every year and the different approaches of the different year. But I'm just aware of the time, and I want to make sure that we have time for question and answers. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to open it up for questions and answers that any of you all might have. We've also been joined by a couple of students who are out of their classes. And so maybe as we're beginning to kind of field some of the questions, we could just do a quick round of introductions. Travis and Wu and Manal, if you guys could just do an introduction of your name, what year in the program you are, if you're an MLA 1 or MLA 2. And then meantime, I'll look at some of the questions as well. So Travis, do you want to jump in?
Sure. Hi, I'm Travis. I am in the 3-year program. I'm in the last year. I have a background in fine horticulture.
Excellent. Thanks, Travis. And Travis is actually upstairs in our studios right now. So if you could just like maybe angle your screen a little bit and people could see, this is a moment in the studios. It's not a studio day, and so it's not super busy, but but there you could see this is the space that we work out of. That is our home on Weybosset Street. And so thanks, Travis. Nice that you were able to show that. I was sad I didn't have any images of our studio. So thanks. Excellent. Wu, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Dongchen Wu. I'm from China, and my background is in landscape gardening. I'm in the 2nd year of my MLA 1 program.
Excellent. Thanks, Wu. And Manal?
Hi, everyone. My name is Manal. I'm in the MLA 2 program, and I'm in my 2nd year, which is also my thesis year, and I have a background in architecture.
Excellent. Great. Thank you all so much for joining us today for the discussion. So maybe we could just start off. I saw there was a couple of questions. I don't know, Marin, if you want to facilitate that, or
First of all, thank you. Yes, thank you so much, Emily. And that presentation was so incredible. I really appreciate it. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to start it off with one of the first questions we got was if anyone would like to elaborate, or could you talk more about the URI RISD joint degree?
Absolutely. Happy to talk more about this, and also happy to jump on an additional call. I'm actually thinking about running another open house that's just specifically to talk about the joint degree. That would be a conversation between myself and Austin Becker, who's the department chair at URI. But I'll touch on it briefly, and then I'll follow up with an email if we are going to do a kind of specific session about that. So we started the joint degree between our department, landscape architecture, and also the Master of Marine Affairs department at URI. We started it a couple years ago because we recognized the need for landscape architects to be able to step into some of these projects that are taking on really complex coastal issues, right? Whether that's around climate change, whether that's about regulations, whether that's about ecology. And the fact that within our program at RISD, we're only, able to go so deep into some of the science and some of the policy issues around working in coastal environments. But that we really wanted to equip students to be able to go out and to be able to practice and bring these kind of both the design expertise as well as the kind of policy and science expertise into their work in coastal environments. And so we started up the kind of joint degree program. And essentially the way that it works is if you're in the MLA 1 program, you would take 2 years within our program at RISD, which gets you through kind of the core foundation of our program. You would then go to URI and do the 1-year intensive there, and there's some required classes, but mostly it's electives that could be taken across science and policy and law. And then the student would come back into our program for their final year. And their final thesis at RISD would also be an opportunity for them to do their capstone project for URI and to really think about how to bring that together into a project that's able to demonstrate and for them to explore the knowledge that they've gained from being in both programs. And so that's the way it's structured. And we believe in the program and we're super excited. We started it up a couple of years ago, but it's been a little bit of a slow start. And so we're eager for students to come into the program who have an interest in pursuing the dual degree, because we really believe in the importance of this type of a practitioner going out into the world. And so, like I said, I'm happy to follow up with anybody has any questions about it. One of the good things about the structuring of the program also is that you get in-state residency by being at RISD for 2 years. And so it makes it a lot cheaper when you go to URI. And so there are other ways that we've kind of thought through the sequencing in order to make that transition and kind of back and forth more seamless. But we're really excited for people to enter it. So more than happy to talk more with people about that if they have any questions.
I would love for the students to kind of speak to how you decided what track to go into, if you wouldn't mind sharing. I know that a lot of our prospective students are kind of trying to decide what would be the best route. And also if you to add on that, if you can speak to maybe your background before. We do have a lot of people interested in these programs who maybe don't have their background isn't directly related. So if you wouldn't mind sharing, that'd be wonderful.
And maybe just before that, Marie, just to clarify, I did see there was a question in the chat about the MLA 2.
Oh, thank you. Yes.
And so just quickly to clarify, the way that our program operates is that if you're coming into RISD with a 5-year undergraduate in either landscape architecture or architecture, you're able to go into the 2-year track because that 3rd year is considered that kind of 5th year that you had in your undergrad. If you're coming in with a 4-year undergrad, we often ask students to go into the 3-year track, just because of the importance of the thesis in our school, which is different than other schools, right? Some schools do not have a required thesis and we do. And so that final year is a really important year. That said, if students do have a lot of experience, work experience, in addition to an undergrad, a 4-year undergrad, we are open, right, to having a discussion with individual students about what the right placement is for them. But in general, it tends to be a pretty straightforward kind of, if you come in from a 5-year undergrad, you can go into the 2-year. If you come from a 4-year, we do ask that students do the 3-year, but like I said, there's a little bit of flexibility. But maybe with that, I think, Manal, you're in the 2-year programs. Maybe you could just speak a little bit about kind of your background and kind of entering into the 2-year program.
Yeah, I have a 5-year undergrad in architecture, and I pretty much entered the program straight after graduating. I did work for about 10 months, but I don't have a lot of work experience. And yeah, I think having a background, especially in architecture, it is really, really helpful when you come into the program. So I understand if people don't come from a design background, it can be a bit difficult to catch up if you were in the 2-year program.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we definitely cover a lot in the program, and so there's but it's always great. I think we often have I saw there was a question in the chat about the class size. Our class size ranges a bit, from, I think in our 1st-year cohort, we have around 18 students now, or maybe 16. The 2nd year is a bit smaller. It's like more around 12. But we often have the MLA 2 students which are on the the kind of 2-year program, and they kind of come in different ways through the program, right? So Manal started with one cohort. So she actually started with Wu, kind of with Wu's cohort, and then jumped over to Travis's cohort because of the nature of the 2-year programs. And so it's always nice. I feel like it actually creates a nice flexibility between the different years of the program. So it's less like, kind of, we definitely don't operate entirely just kind of first year, second year, third year. And the MLA 2s begin to kind of weave those different years together because of the way they move through the program.
And would anyone else like to share kind of your decision on the track that you're in, and maybe a little bit about your background, undergraduate background?
Sure. I definitely didn't have a choice. I had no design degree. My undergrad is in writing for film and television. So I had kind of a still creative, but very different world. And then I ended up becoming a gardener and landscape manager for about a decade. And so I decided to kind of take it to the next level and increase my skills. And I chose RISD, for many reasons, but it just felt like it's an amazing place. I still feel like it's an amazing place to learn and interact with artists of all different kinds. And, of course, we're like always with our heads down in a way in the studio, but the vibes are really good here. I think, especially after visiting quite a few different programs, I just feel like the culture is one of, working hard, but it's not cool to pull all-nighters. It's cool to take care of yourself and do your best work. And so, yeah, that's my spiel.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. I think just building on that, Travis, I think, the community is like a really important part of what we have in our department. And I feel like it's something that is, just like, it doesn't always happen in different programs. And we just really believe in creating a supportive environment for our students. We're not a school that wants students to be competitive or to feel competitive with each other, because there is space in this profession for everybody to thrive, right? And for each student to find what they're passionate about and to be able to pursue that is our goal. And so it's just something that we believe in. And I think we've all had our own experiences in our graduate programs that might have been different. And so we really believe in creating this supportive environment for all of the students, and to really think about, each student uniquely in terms of, and that's why I love the thesis, is because it's an opportunity for students to really be like, okay, this is what I understand from taking, 2 years of the foundation, but this is what I'm really passionate about. And in student studies, we love to work with them and to get to understand and how to help to support them, right, in their own passions or in their own interests, to understand how they can contribute in a meaningful way in the field. And so that sense of community is really important to us, and it's something that we work very hard to foster, both in the studio space, but also during critiques. And we have Manal is part of the ASLA group, and they put on amazing events. There's different ways that we build community in the department is important. So.
Speaking of community, we've gotten a couple questions. We'll start with one is just wondering about the community and collaborating with other students in other graduate programs. Are there opportunities to take classes or partner up with other grad students?
Yeah, excellent. So we do have different studios that are intentionally across different disciplines. And so, for example, the sustainability lab that I mentioned a couple times during the presentation, that is a studio that is entirely based within kind of 2 departments, if not more, right? So it started off between landscape architecture and interior architecture. They have a very specific interest in adaptive reuse, which aligns a lot with the way that we work. But it also is then open to industrial design students and architecture. Travis was in a studio that I offered last year, where it was half landscape architecture students and half I think it was like 6 or 7 architecture students. That was co-taught between myself and architecture professor. And so we definitely try to find intentional ways that we are offering studios across different disciplines. One of the things I've really been pushing for is our students have a fall advanced elective studio, and I've been really pushing, and hopefully by next year I'll have it in place where students can take an advanced elective studio across any of the architectures, right? And so it's another moment where students can move between the departments and meet other people, or because there's so many overlapping questions between landscape architecture, interior architecture, and even a lot of the other disciplines. And so we definitely are trying to find those meaningful ways, both within our core curriculum, but also within students' electives, to help to support them to make good choices about what might be beneficial to their studies.
Excellent. Would anyone mind speaking to how you use your design work to collaborate with, Providence communities as well? We got that question in, which is a great one.
Right. Do any of you want to talk through that, or I can jump in? I don't know. Woo, were you working with Adam on any projects this summer, but that were more designed within Providence?
Yes, we had a project in South Providence, the Nye Memorial Library. So we had like during my summer intern, I had a chance to have a community and public meeting in the library. So we talked about the micro campus in the South Providence, and like for now we just like let the community engage in this project and the garden, and maybe for the future they're gonna have a more planning project or something else. And also this is part of the like a more professional way to engage with the community. And also I'm in the brackish, so they are also or we are also working in like several workshops to educate and to let the the kids and people in Providence to come into landscape architecture and to learn something about the surrounding environment and landscape, and how to using sketches and drawing and modeling to learning and to expressing them. So that's like two ways in my experiences to work with communities.
That's great. And Brackish, yeah, thanks so much for bringing that up. Brackish is a student-led group. They work a lot with local high school students, and they go out to sites, and essentially it's an opportunity for our students to then move into the role of teachers. And they work with local high school students. They go out to sites, they sketch, they think about design. And it's just been a really fantastic way that the school and the department has been engaging more with local communities through that work.
This has been so very informative, and I honestly don't want this conversation to end, because I'm learning so much, and I'm sure everyone is learning so much, because we have really packed this whole week with all different open house events. We do have to wrap this up. It has been recorded. I do want to say that I'm going to drop a link in the main chat for the registration for tomorrow's event for careers. I know there was a great question about how the department helps with, setting students up after graduation. And also thank you so much all for entering in your contact information. I'm going to put admissions at risd.edu. If you have any questions about the application process and whatnot, again, this will be recorded. We will be posting it as soon as possible. And again, feel free to reach out with any questions that you have along the way. I want to thank you all for being here. Thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you all very, very much for taking time out of your schedule.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you so much for hosting, and thank you to everybody who joined. I put my contact in the chat, but feel free to reach out at any time. Really visiting the department is one of the best ways to get a sense for it. And so we're always open to having visitors. You can meet with students. You could come sit in on classes. And so if you are in the area, please come visit. If not, just drop me a note, and I'd be happy to jump on a Zoom and we could talk more about the program. And if you have any other questions, we've been able to get to. But thank you all so much for joining, and hope to see your applications coming up. We also will be having a portfolio discussion, I think, in a couple of weeks that should be emailed out. So more discussion coming up about thinking through how to prepare your materials for applying. But we hope everybody applies, and that we get to hopefully see you all here in the spring for the open house. And so thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Great. Bye-bye.